You don't become invisible all at once. It happens in the small, quiet omissions. A place setting forgotten at the dinner table. A birthday wish a day late, accompanied by a dismissive, "You know how busy we get." They stop seeing you and start seeing only a reflection of their own discontent. In our family, my sister Alice was the sun, and I was the rock orbiting her, expected to be solid, unchanging, and utterly unremarkable. She was bright, artistic, beloved. I learned the core survival skill of our household early: if you can't be loved, be useful. I cleaned without being asked, ate quickly and quietly, got straight A's, and tried not to laugh too loudly. My achievements were phases, my failures were character flaws. When Alice got dumped in high school, it was a 3-act family tragedy. There were flowers, ice cream, a therapist. When I failed a math test and cried in my room, my mother appeared in the doorway, her silhouette a judgment. "Don't fall apart over a test, Judy," she said, her voice cool. "Be strong." In our house, "be strong" was not an encouragement. It was a command: endure in silence so that others can be comfortable. The earthquake that had been rumbling beneath Alice's perfect life finally broke the surface. Her engagement had shattered in a very public, very messy way. Scandalous messages were leaked. Her professional reputation was tarnished. And now, standing in the epicenter of the living room, her hair a furious halo and mascara bleeding down her cheeks like war paint, she needed an architect for her ruin. My silent, steady presence was the easiest blueprint to blame. "You," she shrieked, her finger pointing at me like a dagger, her voice shredding the air. "You've always been jealous of me. Admit it. You did this. You hacked my accounts, you leaked those messages, you ruined everything." The accusation hung there, monstrous and absolute. I was simply in the room when the dam broke, an accidental witness to her collapse. But in her rage and humiliation, the story wrote itself: the envious, overlooked younger sister, finally acting on her bitterness. And my parents, they were the audience, their silence a louder condemnation than any shout. My father stood with his arms crossed, a statue of disapproval. My mother, her voice terrifyingly calm, finally spoke the quiet part aloud. "You are a curse on this family," she said, her eyes devoid of any warmth I had ever tried to imagine there. "Leave. And don't come back." And just like that, the invisibility cloak I had worn for years was torn away, not to finally see me, but to erase me completely. No one asked for my side. No one questioned the absurdity of me, the tech girl, being a master hacker capable of such a scheme. The trial was over, and I had been found guilty of existing. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. There was no fuel left in me to burn. I turned and walked upstairs, the sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears. I packed a single bag, moving through the motions in a state of eerie calm. This was the final, familiar rhythm of our home, a storm of screaming, and then the profound silence after someone disappears. This time, it was my turn. It was bitterly cold outside. My hands shook, but my mind, for the first time, was still. I had no plan, only one promise etching itself into my bones: never again. Never again would I live where my very presence was a problem. Never again would I make myself smaller so others could feel big. Never again would I apologize for not being the golden child. That promise was the only thing I carried with me into the night. It was the first brick in a new foundation, laid in the dark, where no one was watching. The hierarchy of our family was not written in rules, but in the unspoken rituals of our daily life. Alice received a car for her 17th birthday, a little red convertible that screamed for attention. I was given a bus pass and a reminder to be careful. The money from my part-time job was treated as a household resource, while Alice's was hers to keep. She would breeze in late for dinner to a chorus of relieved sighs and warmed-up plates. If I was 5 minutes early, my place might not even be set. It wasn't merely a matter of preference, it was a systematic erasure. Alice was the masterpiece, the vibrant, chaotic painting at the center of our home. I was the empty wall she hung on, the negative space necessary only to define her brilliance. The deepest cut was that I never craved her spotlight. I didn't want the adoration or the drama. All I yearned for was a small, Stable corner of light I could call my own, something warm and constant that wasn't contingent on my usefulness. So, I tried to build it. While my peers were out partying, I was hunched over textbooks and glowing screens, teaching myself design principles, programming languages, and the intricate dance of UI and UX. I was constructing a fortress of skill, brick by digital brick. But at home, the walls were soundproof. To my family, I remained simply the tech girl. My expertise was a utility, not a talent. Judy, the printer is making that noise again. Help your father with his email. He can't find the attachment. Fix the Wi-Fi. You're so good at this stuff. Be useful. That was the only praise I was ever offered, a currency of validation that was always spent on their comfort, never my own. My parents didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was a verdict. My father's crossed arms were the bars of a cell. My mother's cold, disappointed gaze was the lock. In their eyes, I saw the story they had already written, the envious, overlooked younger sister, finally acting on her bitterness. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend the indefensible, my own existence. I just stood there, wrapped in the same heavy quiet I had been swaddled in my entire life. But this time, when I turned to leave, I took that silence with me. It was no longer a burden, it was my property. And when the front door clicked shut behind me, severing the last frayed thread of my loyalty, a final, liberating truth settled in my bones. I am not obligated to fix what they broke. My only job is to save myself. They expected me to return. Of course they did. They imagined I'd last a few weeks, maybe a month, before crawling back, broken and begging for forgiveness, or, at the very least, for a sliver of their attention. But the girl they had cast out had already begun to dissolve, and someone else was hardening in her place. None of them had ever paused to wonder what I might become if I were simply granted a little peace. The first week was a study in survival. I lived on my friend Jessica's couch, a lumpy, floral-printed island in her small apartment. She didn't pry, didn't demand a tragic backstory. She just handed me a pillow, a spare key, and the gift of space. At night, with the city lights painting stripes on the ceiling, I would sit in the dark with my old laptop burning a warmth onto my knees. My fingers ached from typing. I stared at layouts until the pixels blurred, wrote and rewrote code, and turned down freelance gigs that felt soulless. I was building something, a shapeless, urgent thing in the dark. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that if I didn't start now, I never would. To survive, I kept the job at the print shop. The pay was meager, the air thick with the smell of ink and dust, but its quiet monotony was a balm. It paid for instant noodles and bitter, gas station coffee. The real work began when my shift ended. I became a ghost in the digital marketplace, selling logos on design forums, building websites for small businesses for a pittance, offering free UI audits just to add another line to a portfolio no one would ever ask to see. In the deepest nights, I sometimes poured my fears and tiny victories into a sparse, anonymous blog, a digital diary I was sure no one would ever read. And then, one night at 3:12 a.m., as the hum of the refrigerator sang a duet with my typing, something clicked into place. It was a layout I had designed 100 times for clients, but this time, it was for me. I saw it, the clean, elegant skeleton of a digital platform. A simple, intuitive tool that would allow anyone, regardless of their coding knowledge, to create beautiful, functional interfaces. A UI builder for the dreamers, the indie developers, the artists who had ideas but not the technical language. Click, drag, drop, create. I called it Fonshine. A portmanteau born from a desperate, defiant hope. I had finally found my form to shine. I posted a bare-bones beta version on a Discord server for indie developers, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the first week, 20 people used it. Then 50. Then 200. A girl in Brazil made a tutorial video on TikTok, her excitement infectious. The traffic spike crashed my makeshift server. Sitting on Jessica's floor, surrounded by cables, that was the first time I broke down and cried. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, terrifying force of hope. I rebuilt the server, refined the code, and added features fueled by user feedback. The digital seed was sprouting. Within 4 months, there were 12,000 registered users. By the end of the year, my inbox held an email from a venture capital firm. They wanted to meet. 2 months later, they invested $350,000 in me, in my vision, in Fawnshine. 6 months after that, I was sitting in a glass-walled office, the morning sun glinting off the sleek logo on the wall, my logo. I had a team of brilliant, passionate people who called me boss. The salary was a number I couldn't have conceived of in my print shop days. When I had left home, all my worldly possessions fit into a single backpack. Everything else, the confidence, the security, the identity, I had built with my own 2 hands. While they had pretended I didn't exist, I was quietly, methodically constructing something that could no longer be ignored. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a heat, a fire that burns the one who holds it. This was a resurrection. It was the emergence of a self that had been waiting, patiently, in the wings. The final anchor to my old life was cut not by a grand gesture, but by a simple email. It was from an old school teacher, the only one who had ever looked at my intricate code sketches and seen potential instead of a phase. "Just saw your interview in Founder Weekly," she wrote. "I always knew you'd build something of your own." That day, I truly stopped looking over my shoulder. I no longer needed their eyes to validate my existence. I needed only my own. And when I looked, I saw a woman who had made it. Not because she was rejected, but because she had finally stopped waiting to be chosen. I hadn't created Fawnshine for fame or for a headline. I had built it to solve a problem, to empower the quiet creators like me. But stories have a way of leaking out. A tenacious journalist found my old, anonymous blog, the digital diary of a girl sleeping on couches, trying to code her way out of despair. He wrote a feature, and the narrative was too compelling to ignore: the woman who changed interface design. I reluctantly agreed to an interview, never anticipating the ripple effect. It went viral. The story spread from tech forums to business magazines, even to a morning news segment. Asked it at 24, Judy Curtis builds a company now valued at over $12 million. The headlines wrote themselves. The CEO who rose from the couch. I never named my family. I didn't have to. The silence I had left behind, the void where the problem child used to be, now echoed with my success. It did all the work for me. When my face started trending on LinkedIn, a platform my father checked religiously, I knew the fortress of their narrative had finally been breached. The ghosts they had cast out had returned, not to haunt them, but to tower over them. The first cracks in my new reality appeared not with a bang, but with a series of digital pings. Old high school classmates, their profiles frozen in time, surfaced in my DMs. "Whoa, Judy? Is that really you? Your sister used to call you the ghost, remember? Haha. Guess who's doing the haunting now?" Their messages were a clumsy mix of awe and schadenfreude, a reminder that the narrative of my invisibility had been a public one. Then came the anonymous numbers, the voicemails that piled up like unread indictments. I let them sit. Their urgency was not my emergency. But the true masterpiece of revisionist history came when I stumbled upon my mother's social media feed. There, pinned to the top, was the Founder Weekly article featuring my face. Beneath it, her caption, "So incredibly proud of my daughter. She has always been so determined and hardworking. A true inspiration to us all." I stared at the words until they lost all meaning. My daughter. The same woman who had looked at me with ice in her veins and called me a curse on her family was now digitally wrapping an arm around my shoulders, basking in a glory she had actively tried to extinguish. The comments section was a festival of her fabrication. "Wow, is this your daughter? She's incredible. You must be so proud. Where has she been hiding all this time?" I hadn't been hiding. I had been healing. I had been building. I had been in the trenches of my own becoming, while she was back at the homestead, airbrushing me back into the family portrait now that the frame was gilded. As my mother performed her maternal pride for a digital audience, the foundation of their world began to fissure. It started with Alice. A video, filmed on a shaky phone, leaked onto Twitter. It was her, but a version of her I knew intimately, the one reserved for private meltdowns. She was in what looked like an office break room, her face a contorted mask of rage, screaming at a cowering junior colleague. You incompetent little fool. Do you have any idea who I am? You've ruined everything. The internet, that great and terrible beast, did what it does best. It devoured her. The videos spread like a virus. Hashtags were born. People didn't just condemn the outburst, they excavated her entire curated life. The failed engagement was dredged up, recontextualized not as tragedy but as pattern. The brands that had sponsored her authentic lifestyle dropped her within hours. Her side hustle influencer platform, a carefully constructed house of cards, imploded. The golden girl was being publicly, ruthlessly stripped of her guilt. And as she fell, I continued to rise. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. An investor from a prestigious firm, the same man who had once politely dismissed Alice's college business idea as a lovely hobby, reached out to me. He wasn't just offering more funding, he was offering me a seat on their board of directors, a position of strategic influence. I pictured my father, who revered such titles, hearing the news. I declined the offer, but my reply was crafted not for the investor, but for the ghost of my family's perception. Thank you for the immense honor, I wrote. While I must decline, I am deeply grateful that you recognize the value in what I've built, value that was, for so long, overlooked in my own home. The silence that followed that email was more potent than any applause. The world could now see the stark contrast they had refused to acknowledge. The one they had turned away from was now the one they could no longer reach. The fire they had tried to snuff out had not only refused to die, it had burned away the scaffolding of their lies, revealing the brittle hypocrisy beneath. Most importantly, it illuminated the new, unthinkable dynamic, their stability, their social currency, now somehow depended on the daughter they had exiled, while I was utterly, magnificently free of them. That's when the phone began its frantic dance again. 14 missed calls, a single, stubborn one from my father, 3 increasingly desperate ones from my mother, and a frantic 10 from Alice. I watched the screen light up from my kitchen island, the calls appearing like distant weather patterns on a radar, concerning for those in their path, but for me, just data. This phone was a part of the life I had built, not the one I was born into. Their panic was not my surprise. The moment Alice's perfection cracked, their entire ecosystem went into crisis. And where do narcissists run when their reflection shatters? To the one they buried, hoping to find a mirror that still shows them in a flattering light. I made a pour-over coffee, the ritual a calming anchor. I watched the dark water seep through the grounds, a slow, deliberate process. As the carafe filled, a text arrived, a joint message from the family group chat I'd long since muted. Judy, please call us. You don't understand how bad things are. We're family. Let's talk. Your sister is in trouble. She's sorry. We all are. The last line was a masterpiece of offensive delusion. We all are. Now they were sorry. Now that the golden child had tarnished. Now that the only name with any currency was mine. Now that I was needed. The memory of those first desolate months was a cold stone in my stomach, sleeping on Jessica's couch, my spine permanently aching, surviving on canned soup and a fury so focused it was the only thing that kept me warm. They hadn't called then. They hadn't wondered if I was alive. They had told me to disappear, and I had obeyed so completely that I had vanished from their minds. Now that I was emblazoned across their screens, I was suddenly, irresistibly real. Curiosity, that cold and clinical serpent, made me open one voicemail. Just one. I selected my mother's. Her voice was hushed, strained, an actor trying out a new, softer role. Judy, honey, we were wrong. I see that now. We just want to talk. Please, don't shut us out forever. You're still our daughter. The word daughter landed not as an invitation, but as an epitaph. It was the title for the girl who had lived in the shadows, who had begged for scraps of affection. That girl was gone. The woman she had become felt nothing but a vast, quiet emptiness where their approval used to reside. The apology I had once dreamt of, the kind word I would have sold my soul to hear, had arrived decades too late, and it was as hollow as their praise had ever been. The next day, a courier delivered a small, flat package with no return address. Inside, nestled on velvet, was my grandmother's necklace. A delicate silver piece with a single, flawed moonstone. My grandmother, the only warmth in that cold house, had always promised it to me. "It's for my quiet dreamer," she'd whisper. But after she passed, my mother had ignored her wishes and given it to Alice, who had declared it quaint and never worn it. And now they were sending it to me, a tangible token of their surrender, a relic from a past they were trying to bribe their way back into. I held it up to the window. The stone caught the light, flashing with a pale, cold fire. It was beautiful, yes, but it was not priceless. Its value was entirely contextual, and in the context of their betrayal, it was worthless. They only remembered what was mine when my ownership could benefit them. I placed it back in its box, took a crisp sheet of my company's stationery, and wrote a single, unambiguous line. "I don't need anything from you. You made your choice. Now live with it." I didn't sign it. They would know the author. That evening, as the city lights began to glitter like scattered diamonds, I found Alice's number, a digit I hadn't dialed in years, but was etched into my memory like a scar. I typed out a single sentence, a perfect circle closing on a lifetime of pain. "You told me to disappear. You didn't specify how far." The message was marked read. There was no typing indicator, no frantic reply. The silence from her end was different this time. It wasn't the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of comprehension. She was finally feeling the full, crushing weight of every time she had stood by while I was being erased, every time she had accepted a privilege that was my deprivation. She probably wanted to scream, to explain, to beg. But I was already light years away, in a universe of my own creation. I had learned that sometimes forgiveness isn't a grand pronouncement or a tearful reunion. Sometimes, the most profound forgiveness you can grant yourself is the silence that follows their final plea, a silence where you are no longer a daughter, a sister, or a ghost, but finally, unequivocally free. I always knew they would come. It wasn't a question of if, but when. People like my family operate on a currency of attention, and being ignored is an intolerable bankruptcy. Being ignored by the one they exiled, while the whole world applauded her, would be a financial crash of their entire emotional economy. So, when the call came, I was prepared. My assistant's voice, usually so composed, trembled slightly over the intercom. "Miss Curtis? There are visitors here. A woman who says she's your mother. Your father and sister are with her." I didn't answer immediately. I rose from my chair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of my 30th floor office. The city sprawled below, a testament to ambition and concrete, a world I had learned to navigate on my own terms. I looked down, my gaze sharpening on the figures huddled by the imposing glass doors of the lobby, a building they once couldn't have dreamed of entering, a building I now owned. There they were. My mother, her posture somehow both defiant and defeated, looked smaller, tired. The years had not been kind to the mask of perfection she wore. My father paced a tight, anxious circle, a man used to commanding a room that no longer existed. And Alice, she was trying to hide behind oversized dark sunglasses, as if shame could be veiled by an expensive frame. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited for the familiar sting, the anger, the hurt, the little girl's plea for validation. It never came. In its place was a vast, quiet distance, as if I were observing a diorama of a life I'd narrowly escaped. I picked up the phone. "Have security keep them in the lobby," I said, my voice even. "Do not let them upstairs. I'll send someone down." I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that held the artifacts of my past. From it, I retrieved a single, plain envelope. I had prepared it weeks ago, a quiet instinct telling me this day was inevitable. I had just never imagined I would feel such profound calm when it arrived. I handed it to my assistant. "Give them this. Nothing else. And then have security escort them from the building." She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of sympathy and professional resolve. 10 minutes later, the intercom buzzed again. "They're gone, Miss Curtis. Your sister, she was crying." I hung up and sat back down. There was no guilt, only a crystalline clarity. The transaction was complete. Inside the envelope was not a letter, not a check, not a legal threat. It was a photograph. An old, slightly grainy picture taken by Jessica on her phone during those first desperate weeks. I was asleep in the back seat of her car, my body curled into an awkward angle. A cheap, synthetic coat was draped over me like a pathetic blanket. My hair was a tangled mess, my face pale and smudged with exhaustion. My old laptop, its lid still open, was precariously balanced on my knees, its screen dark. On the back of the photograph, in my own handwriting, were two simple lines. "This is what you made. This is what you left behind." No explanations. No dramatic scenes. Just the unvarnished truth. They could do with it what they wanted, burn it, frame it, let it haunt them. It was no longer my concern. Later that day, Alice posted a cryptic story to her dwindling number of followers, a black screen with white text. Sometimes the people you need the most become strangers. Sometimes it's your fault. Perhaps, for her, that was a monumental step forward, a flicker of self-awareness. But for me, nothing had truly changed. They hadn't come out of love or remorse. They had come because they had finally realized I had become someone they could no longer control, influence, or ignore. Their tears were not an apology. They were the frustration of a key no longer fitting a lock. I didn't need their performative grief anymore. Let them live with the silence now, the same heavy, suffocating silence they had gifted me. I hoped the image of that girl, freezing and alone in a car while they ate a warm dinner and laughed in a house I helped pay for, would stay with them longer than all their empty, self-serving words. I stood by my window again, the city lights beginning to glitter like a field of scattered diamonds. You can ask for forgiveness. You can knock on a door you once slammed shut yourself. But locks change over time, and the person on the other side is no longer obligated to open it. They had called me a curse, a label they used to brand me, a narrative to explain away every argument, every breakup, every one of their own failures. The word curse was their favorite weapon. But the thing about curses is that they only hold power if you believe in them. And I stopped believing the night I wrote the first line of code for Fawnshine. The curse they tried to place on me had, through the alchemy of my own will, become my crown. The viral article did more than just expose my family's hypocrisy. It connected me to a tribe I never knew I had. Messages poured in from universities, women's coding communities, young developers, single mothers, and girls who had been kicked out of their homes. They saw themselves not in the glossy CEO headline, but in the girl who lived in her car, who disappeared so she could finally, painstakingly, piece herself back together. Their stories were my story, echoes of the same painful erasure. So, I launched more than a product. I built a sanctuary. The Glow Forward Foundation wasn't about technology. It was about women who had been pushed to the periphery, who had been told they were a burden. We didn't offer lectures on resilience. We provided action. Housing grants, refurbished laptops, access to therapy, scholarships, coding boot camps, a network of mentors, and direct financial aid. We created a web of safe spaces to sleep, to learn, to build. And it worked. I watched one young woman go from sleeping at a bus stop to speaking on a main stage at a national tech conference in just over a year. Another wrote and sold her first mobile game. A third, with a fire in her eyes that reminded me of my own, launched a podcast she titled The Cursed and Crowned. When I heard that, I finally cried because it was no longer just my story. It was ours. A chorus of reclaimed narratives. At a tech conference, I stood before a packed hall and told my whole story. I held nothing back. The coldness of that final night, the ache of the car seat, the dizzying fear of those first freelance gigs, the terrifying thrill of that first investor check. I ended by looking out at the sea of faces, many of them young women leaning forward in their seats, and they said I was a curse, but I was just a mirror. And when they couldn't stand to look at their own reflection, they tried to shatter me. The hall fell into a profound, reverent silence. And then they rose to their feet. Afterward, a woman in her 50s approached me, her eyes glistening. She took my hands in hers, her grip firm. I was the Judy in my family, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I never left. Thank you for showing me. It's not too late to choose a different world. I hugged her, feeling the weight of her decades of quiet endurance. I knew that pain of waiting for a love that never arrives. But it was different for me now. I wasn't searching for peace anymore. I was building it, brick by brick, line of code by line of code. For the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Not because I was let in, but because I had constructed the doors, laid the foundation, and hung the sign myself, with patience, persistence, and a silence that had turned out to be louder than any scream I had ever held inside. And then, I executed the final, most symbolic act of my reclamation. A few months ago, I bought a house. Not for myself, I had a home, a sleek apartment that was entirely mine. This purchase was different. It was a modest, 2-story brick house with a sagging porch and a history etched into its very bones. The house I grew up in. The house I was thrown out of. The house they had called ours while I paid half the bills and sat at the table, my soul burning with a shame that wasn't mine to carry. When my parents' finances, strained by the weight of Alice's fallen star and the silence of the daughter who had once subsidized their stability, finally crumbled, the house went into foreclosure. I bought it through a discreet shell company for the full asking price. My signature alone was on the deed. They moved out last week. Alice made a vague, melancholic post. Sometimes everything falls apart and rebuilding is exhausting. Not a single mention of me. It was perfect. They had no idea of the house's new destiny. I didn't want it for myself. I had a different purpose for those walls. I didn't renovate it with marble counters or expensive parquet floors. I had its walls repainted in warm, calming colors. I ripped out the old, oppressive carpet and sanded the original floorboards back to life. I turned it into a temporary home for girls with nowhere else to go. 6 bedrooms, each named not with numbers, but with words: resilience, curiosity, courage, integrity, grace, and peace. The garage became a bright, shared workspace with high-speed internet. The backyard, once a stage for my loneliness, was transformed into a vegetable garden and a quiet sitting area. We gave the house a new name, the second door, because sometimes you have to close the first one very firmly and hear the lock click before you can find your true place in the world. In every room, on every nightstand, rests a simple, beautiful journal. On the first page, it says, "You are not a burden. You are not someone's mistake. You are not a disgrace. You are a story that was simply too big to fit inside the frames of those who failed to understand you." Recently, I stopped by to check on the final renovations. The smell of fresh paint still hung in the air. A girl, maybe 17 with wary, intelligent eyes, peeked out of the room named Courage, holding one of the journals. She smiled shyly. "Is this your story?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded. "The first chapter." She looked down at the page, then back at me, her gaze piercingly direct. "Do you miss them?" I thought for a long moment. Not about the answer, but about the truth of it. "I miss who I wanted them to be," I said finally. "Not who they actually were." She smiled then, a slow, understanding smile, as if I had just handed her a key to her own future. That day, I walked out of the house, the same door I had been thrown out of years before. The afternoon sun was warm on my face and a deep, unshakable calm settled within me. They thought I was a curse. But I never was. I was always their mirror. And when they were forced to see the reflection of their own cruelty and neglect, they couldn't bear it, so they tried to break me. But here's the thing about breaking a mirror. It doesn't stop the reflection. It just creates 1,000 new ones, each fragment reflecting a different, sharper truth. And now that truth is everywhere, in the eyes of the girls who have finally found a home within these walls, in the women building their empires from tiny apartments, in the quiet, determined words of daughters who stopped asking to be chosen and instead chose themselves. I don't talk about them anymore. Not because it hurts, but because it is peaceful. I used to think I needed closure, a final confrontation, a tearful reconciliation. But what I really needed was distance. And I got it, not by disappearing into nothing, but by becoming someone you can't argue with. They called me a curse. But I was the truth they couldn't hide. And now I walk calmly through that very door I was once told never to return to. Not to reclaim a past, not to prove a point, but to hold it open, making space for the next girl, the one who just needs a little room, a little light, and a single, powerful reminder that her story is only just beginning.